My name is Debbie Stair, and I am the Assistant Director for Leadership Development at MASB. And with me today, I have Cindy Reisig, who is our Business Assistant in the Leadership Development and Executive Search Services Department, and Larissa Moyer, who is the Assistant Director of Communications in our Communications, Public Relations, and Marketing Department. And they're going to help me keep track of your questions. So we're going to suggest you have two options on to how you can ask questions in this webinar series. The first one is through the chat box. Most of you are probably pretty familiar with that. And I guess for those of you that have been on some of our other new board member series webinars, you also know that there's the question and answer feature. So feel free to type in any of your questions in either of those two places. By all means, introduce yourself in the chat box with your name and your district and say hi to folks. It's really exciting for me to have a conversation with you today about strategic planning. You know, I've been on staff for about 8 years now, but I was a board member myself for over 15 years. And interestingly enough, it was at an MASB presentation many years ago where I first learned about strategic planning. I was relatively new in my position, and it sounded so exciting to me to actually put together a comprehensive plan about where we wanted our district to go and what we wanted it to be. And I brought that information back and squirreled it away for just the right time when our district would be poised to undertake that process. And I'm happy to say that they have now done 5 separate planning processes. I have been off the board now for 10 years, but it is ingrained in our community. And so I feel really good about having helped bring that process to our district. So let me start sharing my screen. And let's hope I share the right one again. And Cindy or Larissa will tell me if I mess it up.
You're good, Debbie.
Okay. So let's see. So I really like this photo, this artwork about goals and the fact that without goals and plans to reach them, you're like a ship that is set sail with no destination. And I really think that's what strategic planning helps us do. It helps us figure out where we want to be in the future, and then puts plans in place to help us get there. And without one of those, it's absolutely correct. You have no idea where you're going to end up. If you're lucky, you'll end up where you'd like to be, but without that plan, it's always a little bit iffy. So where does all of this come from? It actually is rooted very solidly in what we call the Iowa Lighthouse Research Study, which took place in the early 2000s. Now, people have been doing strategic planning for much longer than that, but there was a study that was undertaken in the early 2000s about school boards and their effectiveness, and also their impact on student achievement. And lucky for us, the National School Boards Association took that research and really sort of distilled it down into what they call the key work of boards. If you haven't seen that publication from NSBA, I would certainly urge you to think about taking a look at it. It's a great workbook for your district to work through. But in that workbook, it actually talks about these 5 categories, and that if boards really spend their time zeroing in on these 5 categories, that they will have the greatest likelihood of having a positive impact on student achievement. And so you'll see that first one up at the top right-hand side in red is vision. And effective school boards establish a clear vision with high expectations for quality teaching and learning that supports strong student outcomes. So that in and of itself, regardless of the other 4 components, is really what strategic planning is all about. it's putting that vision in place and then putting, like I said, that plan in there to achieve it. But let's just sort of mention the other four components because it's always good to know. The second one is about accountability, and that actually is, consistent with the strategic planning process. It's about setting high academic standards, making sure that transparency and accountability are also things that are put in place in a district because we know that that helps set the stage for a world-class education as well. Policy is how boards sustainably exercise power over time to serve students. And it's through that policy that school boards establish a set of cohesive guidelines that actually help to transform the vision into reality. It's sort of the guideposts and the fencing that you set up for your staff to work within. Community leadership, it's through public advocacy and community engagement that school boards share their concerns and actions with the public. And there is definitely a role to play for your community in the planning process. And then last but not least, but very important, is the component of relationships. And it's primarily talking about the relationship between the board and superintendent here. And that is those essential leadership roles are interconnected and they're different, but it's that unique relationship between the two that really creates an environment where incredible things can happen for students. All right, so MASB for a long time has actually been recommending 3 components on an annual basis. They're really what I would call the nuts and bolts that support those categories you just saw in the keywords. And so you'll see the first one is board self-evaluation or self-assessment. The second one is superintendent evaluation. Now that one is now mandated by law to be done on an annual basis with a few exceptions, but we were recommending it long before it was a mandatory thing. And then you'll see that third one is about goal setting and or strategic planning. And so for districts that don't have a strategic plan in place, they would do something hopefully like an annual goal setting process until they get to the point where they're ready to actually implement a strategic plan. But it's that combination of those 3 things that we really feel are all about healthy governance. So as I said, it's the component of those 3 pieces, and they're so interrelated that I wanted to show you where some of that comes from. So you can see from the excerpts that I've put on the slide, the first grouping comes from our board self-assessment tool that is free to use for member districts. Individuals go on and take the assessment, and then we put together a report and provide that to you. And so you can see that there are a number of comments where you would self-assess in the areas that relate to strategic planning. Can you articulate the vision and mission of your districts? Have you considered community perspectives? Have you defined clear goals for student achievement? Do you, regularly take a look at the progress? And do you monitor the progress and actually tie it to your budget process? So those are some excerpts out of the self-assessment for boards. And then many of you probably already know from whatever training you've taken for your superintendent evaluation tool that there is a mandatory component in the superintendent evaluation process that is progress toward district-wide goals. And so for those districts who have a strategic plan in place, most of them primarily use those goals for the superintendent evaluation component for this progress toward district-wide goals. There may be an additional goal here or there that a board and superintendent agree to, but primarily they're going to use those goals that are put in place from the strategic plan.
Debbie,
Yes.
just a quick question from Angela. She's wondering if on the superintendent part, if they don't have district-wide goals, does that automatically mean ineffective?
it may not mean that it's not an automatic. You would have to have some conversation, and I'd be happy to do that offline if somebody wants to contact me about that. There should be some sort of goals in place. They don't necessarily have to be from the strategic plan, but somewhere along the line, I've got to believe you've got some goals, even if they're not, what's the word I'm looking for? Approved by the board, but there's been some conversation or something along that line. So I think Cindy's going to get your contact information, and we can have a conversation about that. In addition to the mandatory component that's in the superintendent evaluation document, if you're using a different document, there is still likely going to be some pieces in the rubrics that you're using that refer to goals as well. I know that our tool certainly has that, but I would imagine that in most of the other tools, there is some of that in those rubrics. Okay, so let's talk about the board's role in the planning process. They actually play an important and unique role in it, and they plan really for success, right? So the board actually provides direction for the district. They link the district priorities to their role of governance and their work in that area. They assess that progress towards those priorities, and then they're notifying the community about the priorities and the progress toward them. So you can see that those four statements spell out the word plan. Let's take a little bit of a deeper look in that. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. And see the kinds of things that you should actually be considering. So when you're talking about providing direction for the district, these are good questions to, ask yourself and go back and have some conversation about with your colleagues. Does the board understand a planning process that might be in place, especially if you're new to the board and you may not have a clear understanding of the plan that's currently in place, if you have one? When was it developed? When does it expire? How are we doing towards that? And so really going back and asking that type of questions. Are there clearly identified district priorities? Have we done that work? Is there a comprehensive document that is available to the entire community in addition to yourself as a board member? And is the board involved and committed to the priorities that are in a plan, so that it's not just a product that sits on a shelf, but it's a living, breathing project that is ongoing? So as you move to linking the district priorities to governance, sorry about that, do the district priorities accurately reflect the planning process? Do your policies and priorities match? Do you use those priorities when you're making decisions at the board table? Are your staff doing the same thing? Are sufficient resources allocated to address the priorities? That means, are you actually matching your budget to your plan so that you have put together the appropriate resources for the things that you've identified as being high priorities? As you assess the progress towards the priorities, is there a plan to really assess the progress on a regular basis? Regular looks a little different for different districts. There's not a one size fits all, but is there a regular process that we're following so that we can keep track of how we're doing on the plan? Is it even being followed, right? I occasionally see a plan that's in place, but the district has strayed from it. And so that's a good question to ask. Does the assessment process rely on information and data? And if it does, are we identifying what types of information and data that we're going to use to judge progress early on in the process, so that we don't get to the end and we have various ideas about what we should have used? And the last component, notifying the community about the priorities. You know, are you really putting out there information about your planning process from beginning to end? You know, asking people to participate in it and then sharing with them the progress that you're making, so that they understand that a promise made is also a promise kept by the board in the district. Is that flow, you know, often and in various methods, right? And so that you're using different formats to reach the various constituencies within your district. So all good questions to go back and ask, you know, your colleagues and your superintendent if you haven't been having those conversations.
Hey, Debbie, you have a couple questions here real quick. Regarding assessing progress, how often should we be reviewing the progress? Would it make sense to have progress assessment as a monthly agenda topic?
So that's, remember where I said, you know, progress, that what looks regular is a little different in each district. And most of the time, once the plan has been put in place, there's conversation around how often should that be? I think a majority of districts that I have worked with in planning processes look to quarterly updates around, you know, getting information at a sort of deeper level. That gives 3 months worth of opportunity to make progress, so that you're talking about some significant initiatives in many instances. There are some boards who actually tie their agenda items directly back to components from the strategic plan, so they're there all the time. Some take a deeper dive less often. So it's really about having the conversation with your board and superintendent and then agreeing to what makes sense for you and your governance team, and then making it a priority so that it does end up on the agenda and doesn't get sidelined by other things that come along. And so, excuse me. And so the use of an annual planning calendar is helpful in that regard, so that you put those things right into the calendar, you know that they're going to happen on that regular basis. Hope that answers your question. Okay. So I want to show you just a little bit about what the planning process might look like. Now, regardless of whether you use another outside facilitator or you use MASB, or even someone within your organization leads the strategic plan, there's going to be some similar components. I do believe that MASB has put together a really comprehensive plan that we have built specifically for school districts. We do a couple of other organizations like community colleges or libraries, but our planning process has been developed and refined and continues as we speak to be refined to meet the needs of school districts specifically. But whoever does the facilitation of your plan, you're going to see some of these components. So the first phase would be what we would call pre-planning, where whoever's going to lead it would come in, take a look at, you know, what do you already have in place? Are we renewing an old plan? Is it one that's about to expire? You know, are there some pieces from a previous plan or some pieces that we would want to use even if they're not part of a comprehensive plan? Things like maybe you have a mission statement, but you never did a strategic plan in place. So we would take a look at whatever you have already in place, and we would move that into the process. We've determined with the district what the project scope would look like. Obviously, like I said, we have a planning process that we use, but it is often customized to meet the needs of the district. And we would have a conversation with the board early on in that to determine what that process would look like. Then we would move to the second column that you see there, the analysis needs assessment, where we would be gathering data. And our process really relies on both quantitative and qualitative data. Some processes only use one or the other, but it really is that combination that gives you some great insight. So as it As it relates to the quantitative data, we would actually be working with the district to select 5 comparison districts that we would be taking a look at their data in addition to your own. Most of the data we use in our process comes from state reporting sources. So we're not bothering the district with the gathering of all that information. There's a few pieces that are very district specific, but for the most part, we're getting that data from other places. And then we also gather qualitative data. So that's the feedback from your various stakeholder groups. And we would host a number of focus groups in the district. Usually we would do a couple with staff, a couple with community. We'd have one with your administrative team, one with the board. So you would have your own input session. And then we also do some with students. We include both middle school and high school students. And then we talk about if there are any other special groups that are unique to your district that you might want us to meet with. Like I said, we hold those meetings in district. As a result of COVID, we've learned too that we can do some virtual sessions to really expand the number of folks who participate in providing us some feedback. So that will continue to be a part of the process moving forward. And then we also have an online survey component that anyone can take part in as well. All the questions are the same regardless of which method people choose to provide us feedback. But it's really just about getting their perspective around the strengths and the areas for improvement in the district and the kinds of things they'd like to see happen. So the facilitator takes all that information, puts it together in a way that's useful, and then comes back into the district to host what many of you have probably heard referred to in various places in the rest of your lives, maybe in a strategic planning retreat. Maybe some of you have participated in that in one form or another. It's a full day of work, usually with about 40 to 45 folks who wear various hats within the district, some internal staff members and some external community members, a good mix of perspectives in the room. And by the end of that day, we would have a vision, a mission, and some belief statements. Those are the foundation of the work. And we need to know what it is we believe about ourselves, what we really feel is our core purpose for being, and then what we want to look like at some point in the future. And then it's from that work that we actually develop what we call the strategic goals. And they usually are approximately 3 to 5 goals that will see the district through the next 3 to 5 years. Then we come back one more time, and in the implementation planning, and I think this is one of the things that sort of sets us apart from many other facilitators. But for strategic planning, we come back and work with staff members specifically about what are the things we're going to have to look to do in that first year to really get us moving on the plan. Are they the most critical? Are they going to take the most amount of time? What is that going to look like? And so we identify what those first year objectives are going to be, and we help those who might be charged with implementation efforts to really lead a conversation with them about how to put this plan into action. This is usually where many plans stall without this 4th column. And so this was a component we added a number of years ago to the process that really has been very helpful. And for those of you who may have heard of the new MyKIP requirements with the Department of Education, this is where we're going to help marry the 2 processes so that strategic planning nicely aligns with your MyKIP requirements with the State Department of Education so that you're ready to move forward and implement your strategic plan. And then we would come back one final time asking for the board's approval of the 4 pieces that are in that center column: mission, vision, beliefs, and goals. The objectives are there for you to know what's going to happen, but those are not things that the board actually approves, just the 4 components. And I actually have those on the next slide, right? So the beliefs really are a key piece. We have to know what it is that our community believes and how we're going to work together on this, important endeavor. Again, that mission statement that really talks about core purpose for being, the vision, which is really all about what do we want to be in the future, and then those goal statements. So then, once we have board approval on those 4 things, then what we want to do is really spend our time as board members doing that monitoring, right? So we want to keep that plan front and center. However it is that you choose, that calendar for, reviewing the progress towards those goals, but really making sure that everybody knows about it, right? It's being talked about regularly and often. We want to make sure that when budget time rolls around in the spring, that we're taking a look at what those goals are that we have put in place and those objectives that the staff has identified, and we're making sure that we're marrying those 2 things, that we're indeed giving the resources, allotting those resources, whether it be time or money or both, to the things that we have identified as our priorities. I mentioned aligning the goals to the MyKIP process. That's new, we're still working on it, but again, it's really intended to help districts align those 2 pieces, so you're not working on 2 different projects, but really one that has been nicely integrated. The board is really going to also want to look at making sure that you're creating opportunities for continued involvement from the community as the plan moves forward. And that can look differently. There's a lot of different opportunities for that. I'm not talking about creating committees for committee's sake, but when there's an opportunity to bring folks back into the process to help with some things, it certainly is a good idea. We want to continue to create those opportunities for involvement because it also provides an opportunity for folks to own the plan. Scheduling those regular meetings and reports, like we have already addressed. And I mentioned tying agenda items to the strategic plan. Why are we talking about this item? Does it help us move towards our plan? And if it does, great. If it doesn't, why are we talking about it? Why are, making sure that you're looking at your agenda to see where you're spending your time as you fulfill your governance role. Making sure to take time to celebrate successes. I can't stress this one often enough. There's going to be some things in a strategic plan that kind of get waylaid and slowed down. COVID was one of those examples that a lot of people had to put, some pauses on projects that they had identified. And so it'll take them a little longer to work on some of those things. And so those are going to happen. They're natural pieces of a plan. Everything doesn't always go exactly as you want it to go. So when things do go well, right, and you are making progress, make sure that everybody knows about them. Those are the things that help keep the enthusiasm and the interest in moving the plan forward and supporting the plan itself. And then creating opportunities around an annual review and renewal and how we bring folks back together to give them updates and how we might include some new people along the way. Planning some sort of an annual review does help to keep that plan moving forward. So those are ways that the board can really help to keep the plan alive. There's a number of additional benefits that come along with strategic planning over and above, the simple identification of the vision and where we want to go and putting the plan in place. Number 3 is about developing a sense of ownership on the plan on the slide there, and inviting community, both internal and external community members, right? So that includes your staff. Inviting them in to help create it makes them an owner. if a small group of people put the plan together, like just the board and superintendent, then you're asking people to buy in versus owning. Very different feeling in the level of support that most people are willing to provide. When they own it, they want to see it succeed. Again, you're really taking a look at the district's resources and putting them into the avenues that are going to really create the most synergy around moving forward as to what you want to achieve. I think that, again, there's a number of them on here. Number 8, it builds strong teams within the board, staff, and community. and 9 actually, 9 actually is sort of tied to that, about the glue that keeps the board together. I have seen planning processes actually heal communities that have had a divide in them with one circumstance or another. And I've seen divided boards who now have what I would call a unity of purpose in their planning process. And so it's sort of a side effect of the planning process. But it is definitely a benefit for sure. And then it provides a framework to solve problems. I suggest that everybody, excuse me, I am so sorry. I suggest that everybody from the board down through and down to the bus driver, teachers, everyone actually uses that plan as a guidepost for their decision-making processes. Is what I'm about to do or say going to move us in the direction of that vision and the plan we've put in place, or is it not? Right. And so keeping that front and center, again, it helps really provide that synergy for the organization as a whole. There's also some excuses I've heard for why not to do strategic planning over the years. We don't have broad board support, and I would say think strategically about how to gain their support. Perhaps even for an effort aimed at addressing a single issue. Maybe you've had a bond issue in the past that was not successful, and maybe having undergone a strategic planning process would get you better clarity around why it wasn't successful and what it might look like moving forward in the future. Right? Maybe there's no top management support. Again, think strategically about how you might gain their support, or wait until the time is right. That was the situation for me when I first learned about strategic planning. I didn't have top management support. And it wasn't long where my superintendent decided to retire. And when we put a new superintendent in place, strategic planning was one of the things that we addressed early on in that interview process. We're too big or we're too small. You're never one or the other. We do plans for all sizes, including, I think the smallest group we've done might even be for a district of around 200 students. But either way, you still need to know where you're going and how to get there. We've got a union that might not support it. Well, we're going to treat the union as one of the stakeholder groups, right? And we're going to bring them into the fold and make them a part of the process. Maybe we have personnel policies or individual performance goals that you think might not align with it, but really it's about making sure that they simply align with the planning process once it's complete. We've already done it years ago. Well, different times and different places. I would not let that stop me from moving forward. Times change, and you should want to revisit what you've already done in the past to see if it's still relevant and see if it's useful as you move forward. We're already perfect. Gosh, I'm not sure that I've seen a district yet who says we can't improve in some sort of some of the processes that we use. And so I find that one kind of hard to believe, but I have heard it. We don't know where to start. Well, we're certainly here to help you with that conversation. Doesn't mean you have to use us as your facilitator, but we certainly are here to provide you with whatever support in helping you move forward as we can. And we can't afford it is a big one that I've heard over the years. My suggestion would be that you can't afford not to do it. Some folks look at it as an expense. I would say it's an investment in the future and in your students. And then, it's not on the slide, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't address COVID as a reason for not doing strategic planning. There certainly was a reason for many districts to put, a hold on the process. Whether they had already developed it or whether they were into the implementation and monitoring phase, because you just had to put out fires, right? And you had to be reactive to the situation. But as we're coming out the other side of COVID, I think it is certainly an appropriate time to sort of take that longer term view again and say, we've survived this. Let's use some of what we've learned from the process and really help to propel our district forward again. Thomas Munson actually said, our most significant opportunities will be found in times of greatest challenge. And I think we'd all agree that this was probably the greatest challenge you've had so far. Of course, you're all relatively new, so there's still lots of challenges ahead. But I think it'd be hard pressed to say that this might not be the greatest challenge for education in quite some time. So with that, just to sort of wrap it up, I would say, really there's 4 steps to what strategic planning is all about, if we broke it down in its most simplistic terms. And the first one would be is taking a look at where are we now? Getting all of that input, all of that data, and taking an honest look at our strengths and areas for improvement. And then from there, working to determine what do we want to be in the future? What do we owe to our students? What opportunities is it that we want them to have as the governance team, and trying to support that work to make sure that they have everything we want them to have. The third step is implementation. How are we going to get there? Really putting together that plan to make sure that we can support what it is we've identified as wanting to achieve, and breaking it down into manageable pieces so that we all can do the good work. And it looks different. The work we all do looks a little different depending upon the hat we wear, but there are certainly pieces and opportunities for whole communities to provide that support during implementation. And then the last one, and I tell boards probably the most important part for you, is monitoring. How are we going to monitor the progress? What are we going to use to know that we have moved forward, and making sure that we do it? Identify what we're going to use early in the process, and then making sure that we schedule those regular check-ins so that we don't let it slip off the plate. Because one of the things we know about processes like this is that if the board doesn't monitor the progress slows down, and unfortunately, in some instances, can actually stop. And so it is that monitoring that really is the most important component once a plan is developed. So with that, I think I'm a couple minutes early, but I certainly would take any questions that maybe I didn't address as we went through it.
Debbie, Barbara has a question about the MyKIP. She indicates that she's looked at MDE's MyKIP site and didn't feel that it measured academic success by using measurable assessments. The goals for each child look vague to her. And she's wondering how a board member can give feedback on the actual MyKIP tool.
So that would be through the Department of Education. And, they have different opportunities for feedback in the development of any of their processes. And I'm not sure where they are on that right now. I don't know if they've already had that public input. I don't know if there will be more opportunities. I certainly will take it back to my meetings with the department and express the concern that was raised. We continue to have regular meetings with them to make sure that it's our process and their process are going to, like I said, integrate nicely. And so, we have talked a lot about the use of student achievement measures and what that's going to look like. And they've given us a lot of information about what some of that work looks like, with the staff after we leave and the kinds of steps that will be taken. And so I do believe they've thought, very mindfully about the pieces of their process, but I can't speak to their development. I just know how our work leads up to that work. And as we continue to work with our pilot districts, we'll have a better understanding of those pieces as we move through it. Hope that helps. Any other questions, Cindy?
Not as of right now. I did mention to them that we have the member assistance fund available. Gave them the link for that full information. If they have a district that's in financial hardship, they might consider looking at that program.
Yep, that is definitely a great member benefits. I do see one on question and answer about how often do districts typically undergo the process. And strategic plans used to last 10 years. We can't do that anymore. Things are changing at such a pace now that what we suggest is the plan should last anywhere from 3 to 5 years. Most of our districts will choose to do a full renewal of the process at about the 4.5 to 5 year mark. But we certainly have had a few districts who have just run with their process and really worked very hard in implementation and completed some major components early and have felt that it was worth it for them to go back and do the process over again at about the 3 year mark. They're the exception to the rule because most districts come up with some pretty lofty goals that take some significant time. And so the majority of them are, much closer to that 4.5 to 5 year process. Any other questions?
I think that wraps it up. Larissa, what's coming? Oh, we have a last minute one here. For those boards that want to do this process on their own, for whatever reason, they give us a barrier, costs, etc. Can you give a little more detail or cookie cutter forms used in the process so that they can attempt the effort on their own?
So typically, if a district is going to lead the process on their own, it's usually an administrator that actually does the process. So your superintendent or an assistant superintendent, somewhere along those lines. I don't know that there's necessarily forms to use. If someone wants to lead the process, I am certainly more than willing to have conversations with that facilitator. If you're doing it in-house, to talk about, components they should consider, how they might go about using it. Our data packets are something that we put together, for the use and the survey as well. I will tell you that, you know, one of the nice things, and this is not a sales pitch by any means, but one of the nice things about using an outside facilitator, again, whether it's us or someone else, is that it does allow everyone within your district to participate in the process, give their thoughts, use their expertise, you know, the expertise you've hired them for, to actually be a part of the process, because a good facilitator loses their voice in the process and simply moves the process forward. And so it could actually, in some instances, if not done carefully, it could look like the facilitator was leading the group to an already pre-identified outcome when they start talking about their own ideas as they're leading. So you have to do it very carefully. Again, there are some districts who do it on their own, and they tend to be somewhat skilled facilitators and have had some training in the process in some form or fashion. But I'd certainly, Jim, be willing to have a conversation with your district administration if that were the direction you wanted to take.
Debbie, Susan's wondering if you could give some basic frame of reference to cost. You know, I know it depends on number of students and those kinds of factors.
Yeah, we base our costs on student size, student count in the district. I would say right now our lowest cost for those districts with less than 1,000 students is $6,500. And then it goes up from there. And then there are expenses, which are primarily travel expenses, depending upon where the facilitator might be coming from to work in your district. But we're very mindful of those expenses. We really try to keep those down as much as possible. And so, you know, we really we want to make this a member benefit. And so we sort of cover the costs, if you will, to provide this service for districts. So hopefully that gives you a good sense. When you know, yes, you're paying for it up front, but when you look at it as a 5-year investment, I think it's a pretty minimal amount of a, you know, as I mentioned, expenditure or investment, a minimal investment over time to produce the results that many districts have seen. I think the most important part for you to take away from this is to have the conversation with your colleagues, both the board and your superintendent, see if your district is ready for strategic planning, and then make the decision to move forward. Again, we think we'd be a good partner for you, but that is certainly not the only way to get it done. But putting that plan in place and then working it, you really will see some incredible movement in what your district can accomplish. I certainly know my district did, and I've seen some other great examples in districts that I've worked in over the past 8 years. Please know that I am always available for questions about strategic planning or any other governance issues. You can see my contact information on the slide, and Cindy's popped it in the chat too, I see. And we're always willing to come out and do a short presentation about what the process might look like and help you get questions answered to help you decide what direction you'd like to go, should you decide that you want to move forward in the planning process. So hopefully you know a little bit more about strategic planning. Again, think about it, you know, as identifying our destination and then figuring out how we're going to get there.